I'd like to welcome all of you today to our John W. Pope Lecture Series. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly thank the Pope Foundation for their generous support of today's lecture. And now to the main event. Our speaker today, Professor Richard Ebeling, is the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. Dr. Ebeling is recognized as one of the world's leading authorities on the Austrian School of Economics. He's the author and editor of many books, including Austrian Economics and Public Policy, Restoring Freedom and Prosperity, Monetary Central Planning and the State, Political Economy, Public Policy and Monetary Economics, Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian Tradition, Austrian Economics and the Political Economy of Freedom. And he is also a co-author of the 7-volume In Defense of Capitalism. Dr. Ebeling is known around the world for having discovered the lost papers of the Austrian economist and classical liberal Ludwig von Mises in a formerly secret Soviet archive. Looted by the Nazis from his Vienna apartment in 1938, Mises's papers were captured by the Soviet army at the end of the Second World War. Following the document's discovery and translation, Ebeling edited and published the 3-volume series, Selected Writings of Ludwig von Mises. Dr. Ebeling also writes a weekly column on political and economic issues that regularly appears on many well-known websites around the United States and the world. Prior to his appointment at the Citadel, Dr. Ebeling served as president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and he was also the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College in Michigan. One last thing. I regard Professor Ebeling to be one of the world's leading proponents of the classical liberal tradition. He has dedicated his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor to the cause of freedom. Today, Professor Ebeling will speak on socialism, a century of death and destruction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Richard Ebeling.
Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to be with you. I have been to Clemson several times, and I've always had a warm greeting, and you have a delightful campus. I particularly want to thank Brad Thompson for his generous invitation to speak today, and also the Pope Foundation for its financial support to make these events occur. In August of 1993, I was invited to participate in a conference in Vilnius, Lithuania, on the subject of liberty and private business. That was almost 2 years after the formal collapse of the Soviet Union and its disappearance off the map of the world. During our time there, my wife and I were offered the opportunity to be given a tour of the building that had served as the headquarters of the local KGB, the infamous Soviet secret police. Our guide had been a prisoner in the walls of that building in the 1950s. The most nightmarish part of the tour was the basement containing the prison cells and the interrogation rooms. As we reached the bottom of the staircase, our guide pointed to a small closet-like space and said, "This was the first stop on the victim's journey to hell." The prisoner would be stripped of all clothes, naked, and placed in this windowless, pitch-black closet for several hours. This was the start of the psychology of torture. Left naked in the absolute blackness for hours, the victim could only have the most frightening imaginings about why he or she had been arrested, what was to happen, and what might be done to them. And would they ever see their family and friends again? Finally, they would be taken out and brought to a nearby interrogation room. The KGB interrogators asked him or her why they were an enemy of the people, what acts of espionage or sabotage or dissident acts they had performed. Who were their accomplices and what were their names? The interrogators would insist that the prisoner sign a confession, usually already prepared for his or her signature, specifying their crimes against the people and the Communist Party. They just needed the names of his or her co-conspirators. Now, there had been active opponents among the Lithuanian population after the retreat of the Germans and the return of the Soviet army and communist control in 1944 and 1945. Some Lithuanians had fought a guerrilla war in the nearby forests against the Soviet authorities, indeed up into the early 1950s. After all, Lithuania had lost its national independence as a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939 that ended up turning all three of the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, over to the tender care of Comrade Stalin, the dictator in the Kremlin. And the Lithuanians had wanted their freedom back. But in reality, virtually all those arrested and interrogated in that prison in Lithuania had committed no crimes against the state, other than being at the wrong end of an accusation of someone else who themselves had been afraid of being arrested or had given names during their own interrogation just to end anything else happening to them. Because you see, the prisoners' claims of innocence were taken as proof that they were obviously hiding something. And besides, it in fact did not matter if the person was innocent or not. The KGB high authorities expected results in the form of confessions and names to pass on to the higher authorities in Moscow. So the interrogators had to have them. The next stage of the process, if the confession was not forthcoming, was the use of physical torture in various excruciating forms until the prisoner met the interrogator's demands. In addition, family members would be threatened with arrest and that they would be brutalized, tortured, and even killed before the prisoner's eyes if they would not confess. It might take days, even a few weeks, but most of those brought to that KGB basement eventually broke. They would then be told that they were being transferred to another prison. Some were, usually on their way to a forced labor camp. But many would be taken to another room in the basement, on one wall of which was a meter stick. They would be told that they would be given a physical examination before being moved on. Told to stand with their backs against the meter stick to measure their height. A small trap door would open behind their head and they would be shot dead. The lifeless body would be carried to another room where they would be placed on a steel table and any gold fillings in their teeth would be removed. The bodies would then be carried out of the basement through a back door and placed on a truck to be buried in a nameless mass grave with others who had been going through the same conveyor belt of KGB terror. Just 3 weeks earlier than our visit there, my wife and I had been in Austria, and we had visited the Nazi concentration camp of Mauthausen, not far from the Austrian city of Linz. What struck us after our tour of the KGB headquarters in Vilnius, Lithuania, was how similar the Nazi and Soviet methods had been. Indeed, in Mauthausen were the same exact steps and stages of arrest, psychological terror, interrogation and torture, murder through a trapdoor behind a meter stick, and removal of gold fillings from the dead person's teeth. The only difference between the German National Socialist and the Soviet communist techniques was that the Nazis threw the dead bodies into ovens to reduce them to ash and bone chips before disposal. The Soviets simply discarded the bodies in mass graves. The entire history of communism in the 20th century was that of terror, torture, and tyranny. Not one country that followed the Soviet revolutionary model in the 100 years following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 practiced anything noticeably different in either form or content. The noted Russian mathematician and Soviet-era dissident Igor Safarevich, who died actually only 2 weeks ago at the age of 93, ended his 1975 book that was smuggled out of the Soviet Union and first published in France and then in the United States, called The Socialist Phenomena, with the following conclusion and indictment. Most socialist doctrines and movements are literally saturated with the mood of death, catastrophe, and destruction. One could regard the death of mankind as the final result to which the development of socialism leads. Is this too extreme a statement? Perhaps not, given that learned historians of the communist experience in the 20th century have estimated that in the name of building the bright, beautiful socialist society of the future, as many as 150 and perhaps as high as 200 million unarmed, innocent men, women, and children were shot, tortured, starved, or worked to death in labor camps as enemies of the people. Estimates suggest that many as 64 to 68 million people may have died at the hands of the communist regime in these ways during the nearly 75 years of the Soviet Union. Others have suggested that as many as 80 million of such innocent people may have been killed again from starvation, torture, labor camp work, or execution in China from 1949, when the communist regime came to power, to 1976, when Mao Zedong died. Now, for nearly all of recorded history, there have been people who have hoped for and dreamed about a world without want or worry, a world in which cruelty and corruption did not darken the societies in which human beings lived. Power and plunder, indeed, have been the hallmarks of virtually every community of men. But these dreamers wondered if there was not a better way. For thousands of years, that hope for a better world remained basically just a dream. The liberation of humanity from poverty and tyranny only began in a meaningful way a little over 300 years ago, with the rise of what has become known as classical liberalism. A political philosophy of individualism began to take form that challenged and began a process of overthrowing the presumptions and practices of hereditary monarchies, religious rationales for government absolutism, and the stranglehold of mercantilist regulations, restrictions, and controls almost over every facet of economic life in such nation states as Imperial Great Britain and Royal France. We should take a moment to recall the actual achievements of that earlier classical liberalism. It campaigned for and brought about the abolition of the institution of human slavery, first in the West and then through much of the rest of the world. It spearheaded legal reforms that moved society toward a greater degree of impartial rule of law and an equality of civil rights for a growing number of citizens in the form of freedom of speech, the press, religion, and peaceful association. It also brought about an end to the pervasive practice of cruel and unusual punishments by the agents of law enforcement. Classical liberalism reigned in the powers and prerogatives of kings and princes by either transforming political absolutism into constitutionally restrained monarchies or established republican forms of representative government. And in both, over time, more and more members of these societies were extended the voting franchise until the principle of universal suffrage became the rule. In international affairs, classical liberals in the 18th and 19th centuries were the opponents of imperialism and war. They emphasized that kings and even parliaments may wax eloquent about national greatness or manifest destinies and white men's burdens. But it was the subjects and citizens of the imperial and colonial mother countries who had to fight the wars, suffer the human losses in the process. And in that process, imperial adventures equally imposed hardships and foreign rule on those peoples far away who did not wish to have foreign masters dictating and directing their destinies. One of the other accomplishments of that earlier era of classical liberalism was the fostering through international treaties a variety of formal rules of war. Nations at war were required to provide humane treatments for captured enemy prisoners. An occupying power was expected to respect the life and property of foreign civilian non-combatants under their control due to the conflict. And there were to be restraints on the types and uses of weaponry permissible among civilized nations at war with each other. Finally, classical liberalism opened the door and ushered in a never-before-seen epoch in the human condition. And no longer for a small privileged few among the monarchs and the privileged members of the religious orders. Modern free market capitalism was set free from the spider's web of mercantilist economic planning and control. Individuals were declared to have individual rights to their life, their liberty, and honestly acquired property as the means to their respective pursuits of personal happiness. Classical liberals like Adam Smith explained that if there were to be a wealth and prosperity for the general population, all that was needed was what Smith called a system of natural liberty, under which each individual is free to follow his own self-interest in peaceful association and exchange with others in a competitive marketplace. The very nature of interdependent division of labor, Smith explained, requires each individual to improve his own circumstances by satisfying and serving the interests and desires of others as the means of acquiring the financial wherewithal to reciprocally buy from those others what they have for sale that he wants. Respecting individual rights, private property, and free markets enabled the beginning of a new dawn for humanity. Mass production for the masses, guided by the profit motive as such, by each individual pursuing his own self-interest. But as a number of historians and others have observed, never do the imperfections in the human condition and the circumstances of society arouse so much impatience with the pace of improvement as when these imperfections are in fact beginning to be widely diminished and experienced. Because that is what capitalism did. It slowly but surely eliminated the poverty of multitudes of people. It shortened the labors of work in terms of time and effort. It began the liberation of women who now could escape from the countryside and the restraints of husbands and fathers and could now contract for their own jobs in those factories in the emerging industrial cities that may seem backward and harsh and even primitive by our standards, but if one looks at what preceded them, they were liberations for multitudes of women who could now own their own way and no longer have to follow their father's dictates as to who they would marry. It also introduced something that had never been known before in human history: childhood. Finally, parents of even modest incomes could earn enough to support themselves and free the child from working at an early age so that they could acquire an education and have a time of play before entering the workforce. But as I said, as improvements occur, impatience about its pace becomes wider in the society. And that really explains one of the modern motivations of the emergence of socialism. The idea of communism, the common sharing of productive property and its resulting output, is as old as the ancient Greeks, and Plato's conception of the ideal republic, in which the guardians all live and work in common under the presumption that a radical change in the social institutional setting will transform men from self-interested beings into altruistic servers to some defined ends of society as a whole. And this gets to a fundamental difference and distinction in the conception of man in the classical liberal versus what was emerging as the socialist worldviews concerning man and mankind and the human circumstance. Does man have a basic and invariant human nature that may be multi-sided and complex, but no less fixed in certain qualities and characteristics? Or is human nature a malleable substance that can be molded like clay in the sculptor's hands by placing human beings in radically different social arrangements and settings? Classical liberals have argued for the former, that human beings are basically what they are: fairly reasonable, self-interested beings guided by goals of personal improvement and betterment as the individual comes to define that betterment and improvement. The social dilemma for a humane, just, and widely prosperous society is how to design the political and economic institutional order to harness the invariant quality in human nature so that it advances human betterment in general rather than plunder for some at the expense of others. The classical liberal answer is basically Adam Smith's system of natural liberty, with open, competitive, free markets, as earlier explained. Members of what was emerging as the socialist movement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries argued the opposite. They insisted that if men were selfish, greedy, uncaring, and insensitive to the circumstances of their fellow men, it was due to the institution of private property and its related market-based system of human association. Change the institutional order, they said, in which human beings live and work, and you will create a new man. Indeed, they raised to the ultimate humanist societal ideal, a world in which the individual would live and work for the collective, the society as a whole, rather than only for his own betterment at the presumed expense of others in society. In other words, socialism heralded and called for the ethics of altruism. Now, the interested student can read through a huge literature of socialist writings by a host of advocates of collectivism. Some longed for a more agrarian and rural paradise. Others envisioned an industrial future for mankind in which productivity will have reached the point at which machines did virtually all the work. Humanity would be left free, to use a version of Marx's own imageries, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and sit around the fireplace discussing Marxian philosophy with one's comrades, who had also been liberated from work and worry by the arrival of the communist post-scarcity world. In other words, it's sort of like being a tenured university professor. You give a lecture in the morning, you read a book in the afternoon, and spend your evening bemoaning how better the world would be if only the rest of humanity would listen to us about reforming society. And by the way, all at taxpayers' expense. Oh my gosh, Brad, we're living in communism here. Okay. How rude and insensitive of me. But the core conception of the coming paradise on earth is that man's nature could and should be made to change. Virtually all socialists, of all their variations on the collectivist theme, all believed and called for and wanted that. There are a few places, for instance, in Karl Marx's writings, in which he actually speaks of the institutions and workings of the socialist society that would come after the downfall of capitalism. But there is one, in his 1817 critique of the Gotha program, the policy agenda of a rival socialist group that Marx strongly disagreed with. The dilemma, Marx explains, is that even after the overthrow of the capitalist system, residues of the previous system would still permeate the new socialist society. First, there would be the human remnants of the now discarded capitalist system. Among them would be those wanting to restore their system of worker exploitation for their own ill-gotten profit gains. Equally a problem would be the fact that the working class, although freed from the false consciousness that the capitalist system under which they had been exploited was a just one, would still bear the mark of the capitalist psychology of self-interest and personal gain. Thus, there had to be in place and in power a revolutionary vanguard of dedicated and clear envisioning socialists who would lead the masses into the bright, beautiful future of communism. The institutional means of this, in Marx's own words, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, until the masses, the workers, are freed from the individualist and capitalist mindset that they had been born into and mentally made to act within, they needed to be re-educated by a self-appointed political elite that had liberated their minds already from the capitalist false consciousness of the past. In the name of the new socialist era freedom, there must be the reign of a dictatorship made up of those who know how humanity should think, how humanity should act, and how human beings should associate in the communism to come. At the same time, the dictatorship is necessary to suppress not only attempts by the former capitalist exploiters to restore their power over the then and now socialized property of the society. These voices from the capitalist past must be prevented from speaking their self-serving lies and deceptions about how individual self-interested liberty is morally right, or that private property serves the betterment of all in society, including the workers, or that freedom means those bourgeois liberties of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, or religion, or democratic voting, rather than the socialist notion that it is collectivist ownership and direction of the means of production that sets man free. This also explains why the socialist phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat could never end in any of the Marxist-inspired revolutionary regimes over the last 100 years. You see, human nature is not waiting to be remolded like wax into a new human form and content. Human beings are hardwired not to be altruistic and selfless eunuchs. Self-interest, in other words, always rises to the surface in people's conduct. And if it is to be ethically denied, there must be a political force to keep repressing it and trying to constantly extinguish it. In addition, as long as there were capitalist enemies anywhere in the world, the dictatorship of the proletariat had to be preserved in the socialist countries to prevent the infection of capitalist ideas from infiltrating the re-educated minds of the workers already lucky enough to live under socialism. Hence, the Iron Curtain of censorship and thought control in Marxist parts of the world in the name of freedom of the people over whom the revolutionary vanguard ruled. In addition, once private enterprise was abolished through the socialization of the means of production under the control and direction of the socialist government, a central economic plan was now essential, and not only as an ideal that earlier socialists had espoused and called for. If not the profit-motivated individual entrepreneurs in directing the private enterprises under their ownership to satisfy the consumer demands of others in society, then someone must determine what gets produced, where, when, and for what purpose and use. The direction of the people's collectivized means of production requires a centralized plan concerned with designing, implementing, and imposing it on everyone for the good of the society as a whole. This means not only lumber and steel must be assigned a place, a use in a particular place in society, but so must people. Hence, in the communist centrally planned economies of the 20th century, the state's central planning agencies determined who would be educated and for what skills, and where they would be employed and what work they would do. Since the state educated you, assigned you work, and served as your only employer in that job, the state also determined where you would live, not only in what city, town, or village, but what apartment, in which government-owned residential building would be allowed to be your abode. Recreational facilities, places for rest and vacations, the types of consumer goods to be produced and distributed, where and for whom. These too were all centrally determined by the socialist planning agencies following the orders of the Communist Party, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is not an exaggeration. My wife is Russian. We met in the Soviet Union during my trips there when I was participating in market reform and privatization consulting in the last years of the Soviet Union. She lived in a Soviet apartment in Moscow, assigned to her by the state. You had to have a residency permit stamped in your internal passport. Oh, you've heard of passport traveling abroad. Every Soviet citizen had an internal passport. Your name, your date of birth, your place of birth, who your parents are, what your nationality is. Were you Russian? Were you Uzbeki? Were you Ukrainian? Were you Lithuanian? Were you Georgian? Were you Armenian? Were you Kazakh? Were you Jewish? And why was that there? Because the birth of affirmative action of quotas as to who would be allowed into higher education or certain jobs was in the Soviet Union. The quotas for Russians, the quotas for Ukrainians, the quotas for Lithuanians, the quotas for Jews, the quotas for Kazakhs. And the state therefore determined how many of each ethnic group would be allowed types of education and forms of employment, and whether you would be allowed in that quota or be left to find some other place in society far less attractive and worthwhile and materially better. Another denial of the individual and his merit and achievement. Not one corner of everyday life, its form, content, quality, or characteristics, was free from the control and determination of the all-powerful and all-encompassing socialist state. Its design and attempted implementation truly was totalitarian. It may have been Benito Mussolini, the father of fascism, who coined the term totalitarianism as meaning everything in the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state. But nowhere over the last century was this more insistently, pervasively, and coercively imposed than the communist countries molded after the Soviet Union that had been created by Vladimir Lenin and horrifically institutionalized by Joseph Stalin and by all those who followed similar blueprints for society in their own lands in which the Marxist mission was being imposed. I would like also to point out that the very nature of socialism in practice in these societies demonstrated the invariant quality of self-interested human nature. The great German sociologist Max Weber offered an understanding of the evolution of socialist regimes in the 20th century, from revolutionary radicalism to a stagnant system of power, privilege, and plunder into which all communist regimes actually degenerated. Weber defined a charismatic leader as one who stands out from the ordinary mass of men because of an element in his personality viewed as containing exceptional powers and qualities. He is on a mission because he has been endowed with a particular intellectual spark that enables him to see what other men do not, to understand what the mass of his fellow men fail to comprehend. You find that quality in Marx, you find that quality in Lenin, you find that quality in another form of socialism, National Socialism, in Hitler. But his authority, Weber explains, does not come in the form of men acknowledging his powers per se. His sense of authority and destiny comes from within, knowing that he has a truth that it is his to reveal to others, and then knowing the truth will result in them being set free. And when others see the rightness of what he knows, they will follow his leadership. And that leadership following is inevitable and obvious. Now, surrounding the charismatic is an array of disciples and comrades who are called and chosen themselves. This is what Weber says. The group is subject to charismatic authority, the group that is subject to charismatic authority is based on an emotional form of communal relationship. It is chosen in terms of the charismatic qualities of its members. The prophet has his disciples. There is a call at the instance of the leader on the basis of the charismatic qualities of those he summoned. I need you. I call you. I see that you too are chosen to follow me. Weber goes on. There is no such thing as salary. Disciples or followers tend to live primarily in a communistic relationship with their leader. Pure charisma disdains and repudiates economic exploitation of the gifts of grace as a source of income, though to be sure, this often remains more an ideal than a fact. On the other hand, booty, whether extracted by force or by other means, is the other typical form of charismatic provision of needs. Now, once the charismatic and his followers are in power, a transformation soon occurs in their behavior and in their relationship to the rest of the society. Now it becomes impossible to stand outside the flow of the mundane affairs of everyday life. Indeed, if they do not immerse themselves in those mundane everyday affairs, their power over society will be threatened with disintegration. Slowly, the burning fervor of ideological mission and revolutionary comradeship begins to die. Explained Weber again. Only the members of a small group of enthusiastic disciples and followers are prepared to devote their lives purely and idealistically to their calling. The great majority of disciples and followers will, in the long run, make their living out of their calling in a material sense as well. Hence, the routinization of charisma also takes the form of the appropriation of powers and control and economic advantages by the followers and the disciples, and the regulation of the recruitment of members into their group. Correspondingly, in a developed political body, the vassals, the holders of beneficences, or officials are differentiated from the taxpayers. The former, instead of being followers of the leader, become state officials and appointed party officials. With the process of routinization, the charismatic group tends to develop into one of the forms of everyday authority, particularly the bureaucratic. Now, I would suggest that in Max Weber's analysis, we see the historical outline of the historical process by which a band of Marxist revolutionaries, convinced that they saw the dictates of history in a way that other men who were mere mortals had not, took upon themselves to be the midwives of that history through violent revolution. But as the ambers of socialist victory cooled, such as in Russia after the revolution and a bloody civil war, the revolutionaries had to turn to the mundane affairs of building socialism. Building socialism meant the transformation of society, and the transforming of society meant watching, overseeing, controlling, and commanding everything. Hence was born in the new Soviet Union what came to be called the nomenklatura. Beginning in 1919, the Communist Party established the procedure of forming lists of government or bureaucratic positions requiring official appointments, and the accompanying lists of people who might be eligible for promotion to those higher positions of authority. Thus was born the new ruling class under socialism. Ministries needed to be manned. Party positions needed to be filled. Nationalized industries and collective farms needed managers to be assigned to supervise production and to see to it that the central planning targets were fulfilled. State distribution networks needed to be established. Trade unions needed reliable directors. And mass media needed editors and writers to tell the fabricated propaganda stories about socialism's breakthrough victories in creating a new Soviet man in his glorious collectivist society. Contrary to the socialist promises of making a new man out of the rubble of the old order, as one new stone after another was put in its place, and the socialist economy was constructed, into the cracks between the blocks sprouted once again the universals of human nature. The motives and psychology of self-interested behavior, the search for profitable avenues and opportunities to improve one's own life and that of one's families and friends, and the attempt to gain control over scarce resources and commodities so as to take advantage of mutual gains from trade in a world of unsatisfied wants, even in a socialist system, rose to the fore. Since the state declared its ownership over all the means of production, it was not surprising that as the years and then the decades went by, more and more people came to see membership in that nomenklatura, that hierarchy of party and bureaucratic positions, as the path to a more prosperous and pleasant life. In the end, the socialist state did not transform human nature. Human nature found ways to use the socialist state for its own ends. This system of privilege and corruption that Soviet socialism created was explained by Boris Yeltsin, the Russian Communist Party member who, more than anyone else, helped bring about the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, and an independent Russia that at first tried to be democratic. In his book, Against the Grain, Boris Yeltsin explained, "The Kremlin ration, a special allocation of normally unobtainable products, is paid for by the top echelon at half its normal price. And it consists of the highest quality goods. In Moscow, a total of 40,000 people enjoy the privilege of these special rations in various categories of quantities and quality. There are whole sections of GUM, the huge department store that faces the Kremlin across Red Square, that is closed to the public and specially reserved for the highest of the elite, while for officials a rung or two lower on the ladder, there were other special stops. All of these were called special. Special workshops, special dry cleaners, special polytechnics, special hospitals, special houses, special services." What a cynical use of the word, Yeltsin said. Now, this is not an exaggeration. I had an opportunity to see elements of this, okay? Your son or daughter is ill. You need some medication, right? Some antibiotic. You go to the local clinic or hospital for the masses. Forget it. It's not there. Not enough has been produced according to the central plan of what society needs. If you don't have contacts, friends in the upper echelon who have access to these special stores, you have to go to the black market. And at some exorbitant price, certainly by the Soviet money standards of that time, to acquire it with no uncertainty of its quality and potency. But how else might you keep your son or daughter alive? No contraceptives. That wasn't part of the central plan in any great quantity. So what was the primary method of birth control in the Soviet Union? Abortion. The average Soviet woman had anywhere between 4 to 8 abortions during her life. Now, whether you're pro-abortion or anti-abortion, I think most people would agree that is not the preferred method of birth control. Oh, and by the way, when you're in the hospital for the abortion, don't expect any painkillers or anesthetics. It's not part of the central plan to produce enough of it. You went into the stores and the shelves were empty. The products that were there were of shoddy and poor quality that nobody wanted. Mismatches between supply and demand. No satisfaction of what consumers wanted relative to what the planners decided to produce. An economic disaster with hardships and problems. My wife, she was married before, she had a daughter from her first marriage. She once waited 48 hours on a line to buy a pair of shoes for her daughter with no certainty that any would be available by the time her time got there, or that they would have the size that she needed. I have to do couple of more examples of this because people just don't understand this. We take for granted, you go into the supermarket, you get your shopping cart, you go down the aisles, you fill it with this, you fill it with that, you go to the checkout counter, and we get irritated if they haven't opened enough lines and we have to wait 5 or 10 minutes. Okay? How do you shop in the Soviet Union, or did shop in the Soviet Union? Well, every retail store was a government store, no private enterprise. So there's the People's Bread Store. You enter the People's Bread Store and you get on a line. And the line takes you to the counter at which you'll point to the bread, assuming there is any, behind the counter. 1 wheat, 1 pumpernickel, but you don't get the bread. You get a ticket. And with that ticket, you go to a second line in the bread store. And you wait on that line your turn, which could be anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. And what do you do on the second line? You pay for the bread that you want. And now you have the receipt, and you go to a third line, and you wait and wait and wait. Now your turn to pick up that which you bought. 3 lines of time-consuming monotony and irritation and concern as to whether it will really be there and any left by the time you're ready to pick it up. Now you have your bread, but I've heard the rumor that man does not live by bread alone. So now you want milk and butter. You have to go to the People's Milk Dairy Store. And again, line 1, line 2, line 3. Maybe you want meat, assuming there's any meat. You go to the People's Meat Store, line 1, line 2, line 3. And you're carrying the bags from store to store, and they're not next to each other. And imagine that in the middle of a Russian winter with the cold and the snow. Ah, the worker's paradise. But no greedy capitalism trying to make money after satisfying your consumer wants. The promised classless society of material and social equality was in fact the most granulated system of hierarchical privilege and power. Bribery, corruption, connections, favoritism permeated the entire fabric of Soviet socialist society. Since the state owned, produced, and distributed anything and everything, everyone had to have friends, or friends who knew the right people, or who knew the right person to know how appreciative they could be with that bribe, to have access to something impossible to obtain through the normal channels of the centrally planned distributive network meant for the masses. And overlaid on this entire socialist system of power, privilege, and communist party-led plunder was the Soviet secret police, the KGB. Spying, surveillancing, threatening anyone and everyone who challenged or questioned the propaganda of the workings of the workers' paradise. In 1899, the French social psychologist Gustave Le Bon, well known for a book of his called The Crowd, but in a book that he wrote on the psychology of socialism in 1899, looked out and saw the growing socialist movement as the 20th century was approaching. And he sadly said, "One nation at least will have to suffer it for the instruction of the world. It will be one of those practical lessons which alone can enlighten the nations who are amused with the dreams of happiness displayed before their eyes by the priests of the new socialist faith." Not only Russia, but many other countries in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America have been forced to provide that practical lesson in the political tyranny and economic disaster that socialist societies, and especially in its Marxian permutation, offer it to mankind. It stands as a stark demonstration of the disastrous consequences when a society fully abandons a political philosophy of classical liberal individualism, abandons an economic system of free market competitive capitalism, and abandons an acceptance of self-interested human nature, functioning within a social arrangement of voluntary association and peaceful exchange. Let us hope that with this year's marking the 100th anniversary of the communist revolution in Russia, mankind will learn from this tragic mistake, and they will realize that only individual liberty and economic freedom can provide the just, good, and prosperous society that mankind can have and should have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ebeling. We've got about 30 minutes for questions. So it's our tradition at the Clemson. It's our tradition at the Clemson Institute to take the first couple of questions from students. So if there are any students out there who want to ask a question, this is your opportunity.
Socialism traditionally meant for every socialist in the 19th century and through most of the 20th century, government ownership of the means of production and centrally planned economic activity. None of the Scandinavian countries have such socialized and centrally planned economies. They have often toyed with that with certain industries or sectors of the economy. But in fact, Sweden, Denmark have relatively vibrant private competitive sectors trading in the world. Do they have welfare states? Yes. But even in that, they've often reformed them and attempted to set up incentives for people not to become dependent or abusive of them. So what you have are interventionist welfare states funded from the productive part of the society. I don't view them as socialist economies. But I'll just say one thing in response to part of your question. You said that in countries like Sweden, for instance, they have free healthcare and free education. Well, there's a phrase made well known by Milton Friedman. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. It's not free. It is paid for by others who are taxed. Now, what does it mean when those others are taxed? They have less money to improve the lives of their own family. They have less money to plan for their own retirement. They have less money to save and invest. There is nothing free in this. It is a redistribution of some of Peter's money to Paul. On what basis? The judgment of some in political power that they arrogantly, in my view, presume to know that this person has too much, this person has too little. It's as dictatorial and arbitrary and as abusive in its own way as the type of Soviet experience that I talked about. It's just done through a soft velvet glove, so it doesn't seem as if you're being harassed by a tyrant in the Kremlin.
Hey, Dr. Ebeling, thank you for being here. My name is Matthew Phillips. I'm one of the Lyceum scholars here. And I think you mostly answered my question, but I think I'll ask it in a different way, so
Sure.
maybe I can hear a different set of answers. But is there any form of government planning or government involvement in the economy, such as tariffs or social welfare programs, that you do think is beneficial to a society, or do you think that overall a completely free market is the best way of an economy?
Well, I'll start with the conclusion and then explain the reasoning. I believe that only an open, competitive, free market economy is a rational, just, and prosperous generating institutional order. Now, why? Well, first of all, I personally hold a basic value. A person has a right to his own life. Please raise your hand in here. Who wants to be a slave? That someone else tells how they'll work, where they'll live, how much they'll have to eat and consume, and they can't do anything without someone else's actual permission under threat of them doing bad things to your body. Please raise your hand. Who wants to be a slave here? Not one. So all of us in ourselves, intuitively, just as human beings, have a desire for latitude and liberty to live our lives as we want to, as long as we do so peacefully and honestly. There is nothing that the government can do that does not involve coercion in the intrusion of what otherwise should be the self-guided and self-responsible and self-choosing actions of each of us as free human beings. Now, that is what sort of the ethical or moral perspective I have. Let me sort of narrowly more talk about the economic rationale for this. One of the most noted economists of the 20th century was an Austrian economist named Friedrich Hayek. And one of his major contribution insights is the fact that we live in a world that not only has division of labor, but a division of knowledge. And these types of knowledge are a diverse and subtle and complex type. Each of us has knowledge of skills, abilities, circumstances, opportunities, hazards that the rest of us do not have. And we each sort of evaluate and weigh these in terms of value, cost, importance, significance, differently than others. Now, go beyond the people just in this room and now think of everyone in the world. There is more knowledge in the world, more knowledge in a country, more knowledge in Clemson, South Carolina, divided and dispersed among all the people living, than any government planner, regulator, or intervener could ever hope to master, integrate, know, and appreciate sufficiently to coordinate all the actions of everybody, better than leaving each individual free to follow his own peaceful course in interactive association with others in the marketplace, guided by profit opportunities and the signals of prices as to what people want and what the cost of bringing it to them would entail. It is arrogance, it is hubris, or as Hayek called the title of his Nobel lecture, a pretense of knowledge for those in political power to believe that they have the sufficient knowledge, wisdom, ability to direct, guide, and determine people's lives and activities and the worth of their doings better than individuals in free, agreed-upon association themselves.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I will ask a question, waiting for somebody else. And the floor is now open to anyone who'd like to ask a question. Richard, often you hear it said that communism is good in theory, it just doesn't work in practice. Mm-hmm. So how do you respond to that argument?
Well, that would be like saying, in my opinion, you know, pink elephants that flew through the air would be great in theory. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work in practice. Well, guess what? The theory's wrong because that's not what elephants are anatomically made to do. The idea that, oh, if all men could just live together in communal sharing and only a concern for everybody, that is not human nature, nor is it even possible. And therefore, it is inconsistent, as I suggested, with the hardwired nature and makeup of our human nature, and that has been for all of known recorded history. So I think it is unworkable in practice because the theory itself is misguided.
A question. With all that we see in the world and the failure of socialism and communism, why is it continuing being reinvented as a new thing?
That's a really interesting question. Why is, if it sort of fails every time it, you know, it's sort of like you see just in Latin America today. I mean, nothing could have been a bigger failure or demonstration of the failure of communism. It was in Cuba. Okay, the country has been a basket case that for decades lived off the subsidized largesse of a Soviet Union that wanted it as a forward base in the Western Hemisphere. The Soviet Union's gone, and those subsidies from Moscow disappeared. And the economy has wallowed in stagnation and want. You know, the imagery of, oh, they're still driving 1950s cars in Havana that were there before Castro came to power in January of 1959. Yeah, because the system has no ability to produce. And then Venezuela, oh, yes, Venezuela, a new socialism. People are starving. Their money is worthless. The system is corrupt. Violence is used to suppress dissent. But I'm sure that there'll be another, but next time we'll get it right. There seems to be something that is appealing to people in the idea of this collectivist society. But more importantly, why does it rise up? It's not from ordinary people. It's always from segments of the intellectuals. And I believe that often it is, you know, Marx came from a middle-class family. Lenin came from a middle-class family. Okay? Fidel Castro came from a middle-class family. Okay? It's not as if, oh, they rose up from the poor and the wretched. No. But there seems to be something in too many intellectuals, perhaps sitting in their ivory towers, in my opinion, that, oh, we deal with the good and the beautiful and the just. We're above, you know, dirtying our hands in profit making, making a faucet for a kitchen. Oh, no, that's for the lower people who are just ignorant and uninformed. We know how society should be organized. We know human relationships in the right patterns and shapes. We know how the society should be remade. And it's that appeal to this fairyland of believing that you know better how to remake society than the emerging forms that society takes through the spontaneous interactions of leaving people alone that brings this phoenix constantly rising from the ashes. Oh gosh, and I said this at a university. Oh God, I'm such a bad person. Have I upset any faculty members? Should I give them trigger word warnings? God, there's a little space here. There's a safe space there. Oh God, I'm sarcastic. I'm probably going to be ridden off the campus on a rail. Any other questions and comments?
I have one.
Sure.
So I noticed that you're critical of the Soviet system of setting quotas for specific ethnic groups living in particular areas. I couldn't help but see the parallel with our current immigration system, which sets quotas for people from specific countries. And I was wondering, what do you think the role of the government is in controlling the labor market in such a way as border controls?
Well, I think that I'm going to sound even really radical here, in ways that perhaps will surprise some people. I believe that limited governments have administrative duties and responsibilities, and there are demarcations of their administrative authority, such as, well, there's North Carolina and South Carolina, there's Georgia and Alabama. But notice, we travel across those administrative borderlines freely as people, for work, for vacation, for just a ride, to visit friends, whatever. I believe that in a free world, borders should no more be restrictions on the free movement of people for either work, residence, or mere tourist travel, than the line that separates South Carolina from Georgia. That should be the ideal in a truly free world. People should have the freedom of movement. The freedom of movement. I believe that that is an element of the free society. And by the way, in the 19th century, it was for the most classical liberals. Passports were virtually ended following the Napoleonic Wars that ended in 1815. And over the next several decades, virtually every major European country did away with passports. It is estimated that between 1840 and 1914, 60 million people, that's 60 million people, left Europe to make their homes in other parts of the world. Of the 60 million, approximately 35 million came to the United States. And they came without visas, without passports, without vetting. Were there crooks, con men, hucksters among them? Were there people who were escaping from having been some rogue and card sharp in the old country? I'm sure. And I'm sure that if we went back through the lives of our ancestors, we'd find a few who came to America who had those checkered pasts. But America did not place a bar in it. My grandparents came to America at the beginning of the 20th century as small children. They landed on Ellis Island. Were there customs agents there? Yes. They asked basically two questions. One, a politically incorrect term now. Are you an imbecile? That is, do you have a mental defect? If you didn't, no problem. Did you have a communicable disease? If you did, you were held in quarantine until the contagious period ended, and then you would board a ferry, take the short ride to the south end of Manhattan Island. You would disembark on the dock and welcome to America. You found fellow countrymen or people or your relatives who had arrived earlier. They often provided, adjustment safety nets to help you get oriented, learn the language, help you get your first job, put you up at their home until you had enough money to hopefully get your own place. But that's how it worked. And I believe that in a good and right and just world, that should be the ideal once again.
If we don't have more questions, I will continue to ask questions. So everybody feel free to come on down. There we go.
How you doing, Mr. Richard Ebeling? In the ideal just world, do you believe that it would ever happen to be that way, like in Ellis Island?
There would ever be what? I'm sorry, I'm missing what you're saying.
The immigration of Ellis Island and your grandparents. Do you believe that in this state, in the modern state?
In the modern state, that kind of freedom could occur?
Yes, sir.
In principle, yes. In principle, yes.
Can you explain why, please?
Okay. Right now, what is the barrier to free movement of people into the United States? There's basically three arguments that people make. He's going to steal my job. I'm going to pay for his welfare and other entitlement payments, and he's a terrorist. I mean, that's the basic three arguments. The first one, he's going to steal my job, is a deep economic fallacy. In a system of division of labor in which scarcity exists, every additional pair of hands can fill a niche that previously we did not have enough hands to do. So in virtually all circumstances, more hands means intensified division of labor and improvement in the conditions, not only of the person coming to the United States for an opportunity better than the one he sees at home, but for all those in America. That's just an economic fallacy. The problem with the welfare state is a concern, but I don't think it's an insurmountable one. I think it's very simple to say anybody can come to the United States and just for the sake of politics, for the first 10 years, you and your family dependents are ineligible for any welfare programs. That's shocking. No, that's how it was when my grandparents came. There was no welfare safety nets. There was no food stamps. There was no public housing. There was no social redistributions of wealth. You came to America, you had those private networks of support, and you were on your own. So all that this would be is saying that all those who want to come to the United States are free to, but no social welfarism of any form for them and their family dependents for, let's say, the first 10 years or 15 years. Some people will make it. Some people will choose to go back to the old country. And by the way, the census data also shows, well, everybody wants to come to America and always have. No. That census data of before passports to the United States showed that approximately 15 to 20% of the people who came to America eventually went back to their own whole country. They couldn't adjust to America, they missed their families, or they made some money in America and wanted to go back to the old country to retire and die and be buried among their ancestors, okay? So I don't see that that's an insurmountable one either, with that type of change. People say, but aren't they second-class citizens? No, it just means that you're not eligible for certain things. Someone can be a legal resident of the United States with a green card, but unless they're a citizen, they technically are they're not allowed to vote in national elections. They have the same civil liberties, the same protections under rule of law. It's just that you can't vote. That's a prerogative of being a citizen. Well, you can come here, but for X number of years, as I've suggested just for the sake of the argument, you're not eligible for social welfare programs. I think that dissipates the arguments of those who are concerned, oh, they're coming and I'm going to have to pay for their welfare. And then the third one, terrorism. Are there bad people in the world? Yes. Have there always been bad people in the world? Unfortunately. Will there continue to be bad people in the future? That's likely too. But the fact is that most people who come to the United States are not terrorists wanting to attack, blow up, or kill people. And I don't see that people should be judged on that basis unless there is clear and evident demonstration that they either are committing such an act or, in the proper legal sense, are viewed as eminently threatening to undertake such an act. The presumption is that an individual is innocent until proven guilty. So I'm less concerned about these issues of terrorism. And I'll just add one proviso in this also. I'm really showing my classical liberal, old-fashioned classical liberal colors. I think we would not have much of this terrorism problem if America did not put its nose into foreign adventures that arouse the anger, indignation, resentment, and desire for revenge on the part of those whose lives we try to manipulate in faraway lands. There's an old adage, the friend of my enemy is my enemy. The United States government cannot intervene in any country anywhere in the world without inevitably picking sides, because there's always differences of opinion in the country. And if it is a severe and radical difference, such as a civil war or some type of thing going on in that country, and the United States government supports X, don't be surprised that the people on the Y side view you as supporting their enemies and therefore end up targeting you as well. So I think that those things could diminish these concerns as well. Okay, any other comments? Yes.
Thank you for speaking, Dr. Ebeling, and taking questions. My question is regarding, you offer capitalism in the classical liberal sense of its veneration of the individual as a correctant for the ills of socialism. Do you believe that there is any benefit in looking to the altruistic virtues of socialism, like in terms of collectivism as a correctant for the potential pitfalls of complete laissez-faire capitalism?
Okay. I think that it is also part of that human nature that I refer to as invariant. However multi-sided and complex it might be, of concern with other people. I assume, like you, like myself, I care about my family. I care about many friends. I have a general concern for others as humanity. But I believe that the only just and moral society is one that allows individuals to make those charitable and philanthropic decisions their own. There was a book back in the 1950s by a French social philosopher named Bertrand de Jouvenel called The Ethics of Redistribution. And he said that many people think that redistribution means taking from Paul to give to Peter. But he said, no, what it really is transferring wealth and financial means from Paul to the political authorities, who then determine what Peter will have. He argued that not only that itself was not necessarily a desirable thing, concentrating so much decision-making in the hands of those in political power to determine the distributional fate of others. But more importantly, he said it undermined the very type of sentiments that you're talking about. He said that having a degree of wealth, it need not be great, even a modest wealth, places a moral obligation on an individual within himself. How much will he, besides his own needs and his family's, think of the support through benevolent consideration of others, charities, philanthropies, of his time serving on a philanthropic board of directors, being on the symphony orchestra committee and that type of thing. To the extent that the state siphons off our wealth and diminishes our discretionary income to do many things, including those, it undermines, de Jouvenel argued, the intergenerational passing on of these values. You know, often the child walks like the father or the mother. The child observes and copies. Well, many things are like that. If the child grows up in a household in which parents say, you know, let's not forget to give our Thanksgiving or Christmas giving for the needy and the homeless. Let's not forget to send in our contribution for the cancer research or this or that or the other. Or, you know, I've been approached, maybe we should give a weekend to do of in-kind charitable work ourselves. Now, this is not just fairy tales. The fact is, in the 19th century, before the modern welfare state, by the 1890s, it was estimated that in Great Britain there was more private charitable giving than the entire budgets of several European continental governments. That middle-class English women were devoting anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of their time to in-kind charitable work, personally serving at the Salvation Army or at a food kitchen or something else. Okay? When people have the latitude and the liberty, both in themselves and with their finances, to make these decisions, they learn to exercise the moral question as to whether they should do it and the extent and the form of it. When you take that away and transfer it to the state, you desensitize and dehumanize people because, hey, I paid my taxes, it's not my concern, it's the government's concern. No, it should be our concern, but it's more likely to be fostered and cultivated in the type of free society I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So obviously, social issues have kind of become a problem, especially, or a place of polarization, especially in recent election. I was wondering how you responded to, it seems that like a lot of conservative capitalists are fans of, free market and, letting the individual decide stuff, but then I find it hypocritical in social settings that they, don't think that certain people should, get married or stuff like that. I was wondering if you could address, it just seems hypocritical to want a free market society making money but not with social issues.
That's a dilemma in our society that has nothing to do with being pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist, in business or out of business. The fact is that we are going through a huge social transition of how we view people and what are viewed as acceptable under the law of societal interactions and relationships. One of these that is challenging the society now is same-sex relationships, marriage, transgender issues. You have to remember that society changes slowly, and by which I mean people grow up in a society, and they have learned cultural values, attitudes, and beliefs. But transitions and changes are always occurring, and it takes a while for people to change this. This has happened in racial attitudes. I'm old enough to remember that an actor named Richard Roundtree starred in a movie called Shaft. Richard Roundtree, African American. He's a private detective, and it was shocking. Why? Because there's a scene in the movie in which he's in the shower with a white woman. Oh God, that's cutting edge. Well, times have changed. There's a television show that's on now called Scandal, and the star is a female African American woman who's been simultaneously having affairs with two white men, one of whom is president of the United States in the story, and nobody cares. I mean, social attitudes have completely changed, but it doesn't happen overnight. And these will too, but it's no more hypocritical, in my opinion, than the left liberal who says, oh, I believe in people having free choice and living their life the way they want, and, reading what they want and having sex with whomever they want and smoking whatever they want, except cigarettes. I find that a strange contradiction too. Hey man, pass the joint, but don't smoke that cigarette. Anyway, but besides that, this attitude, you'll be able to have sex with whoever you want, and it doesn't matter, diversity, but not in the marketplace. No, you can't freely decide who you're going to work for and at what salary. No, you can't run your business this way. The government has to tell you how to run it and what profit you can earn and to whom you can sell. Okay? These are contradictions and hypocrisies on both sides of the political spectrum. Personal freedom is inseparable from market relationships, because that just means the choice of whom you want to interact with for certain activities that end up being mutually beneficial. So these things take time. The biggest problem I find is the entrenchment of the socialist mindset that somehow personal freedoms are okay, but market freedoms are not. And that's the residue in our society that Marxism has left on us. Yeah. Who was first? Okay.
Hello. You've spoken a lot about free markets and capitalism today,
Right.
and I was wondering, a lot of my fellow classmates grew up during the Great Recession and all that, so I was wondering if you could talk about Dodd-Frank and whether or not you believe government has a role in regulatory markets.
Okay, that's a big topic. I'll give you the extremely abridged version. The boom between 2003 and 2008 was due to the misguided and misdirected monetary policies of the Federal Reserve. They created a whole bunch of distorted mismatches in the housing market, in the financial market, and therefore the boom, the crisis and the decline was inevitable. If the economy is thrown out of whack and balance, don't be surprised if the distortions finally rise to the surface and artificial values fall. What needed to be done, in my opinion, is not another overlay of regulations and controls on the banking system. Most of them are egregious in their cost and in their interference with financial flexibility just to adapt to changing circumstances. It's to see that government doesn't play this game again. I mean, why was there a housing crisis? First of all, the Federal Reserve puts the financial markets awash with money. If any of you have taken a money in banking or macro class, there are two measurements of the money supply commonly used, M2 and MZM. They're just cash, checking accounts, and so on. Between 2003 and 2008, those increased, depending upon how you measuring them, around 40 to 50%. That's a huge monetary increase. So the financial markets are awash with money. Interest rates are artificially pushed low. There's plenty available to lend to anybody for every harebrained scheme. And on top of that, you have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two federal agencies strong-arming mortgage companies to lend to uncredit-worthy borrowers because it was considered by the politicians pushing it to serve certain social goals that serve their re-election interests. And so with awash in money and politicians through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac giving anybody a loan. He doesn't have to have a good credit rating. He doesn't have to have a good credit history. He doesn't have to have a down payment. Just give him a house, because that seems good. Well, don't be surprised that you're going to create this unsustainable boom in the housing market. What you want to do is not to have those stupid policies again, and prevent the crises from occurring in these cyclical fashions, and not laws like Dodd-Frank, which mostly are just overlays of further regulations that clog the system and don't help it. Yes.
Utilitarianism tries to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number of people.
Right.
And the law of diminishing marginal utility essentially says that utility increases at a decreasing rate.
Right.
Taking these two principles in conjunction and looking at wealth, each successive increment of wealth allows the individual to achieve less utility than the one prior to it. Lots of people look at that and say that maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people would involve redistributing wealth to an equal level, at least getting as close to that as possible. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'm going to use a phrase that I recall from my youth during the hippie generation. It's all in your head, man. What do I mean by that? Okay. To determine the significance or importance of a thing like money or wealth to someone is purely subjective. Let me make an extreme example, but it sort of makes the point in one sense. You have one person who's on a very modest income, and you have a person who has socked away $1 million. Well, look, this person has $1 million. This person has maybe $10,000. Surely the marginal gain from transferring $100 from the wealthy person to the poor person will make the poor person happier at the margin than the loss of utility from that $100 off the million. Now let's suppose that the millionaire's son has been kidnapped, and the ransom is $1 million or the son is killed. Now, assuming he likes his son and cares if he gets killed. But assuming that he cares for his son, he has to have $1 million. If you take that $100 away from his $1 million stash, what's the lost utility to him? His son's life. Well, is his son's life more important than the $100 you're going to give to the $10,000 a year guy? It's based upon circumstances, evaluations, judgments. And the idea of interpersonal comparisons of utility are impossible to make. This is a personal judgment that is raised to the level of scientific exactitude when it is not. And I just consider it a false thing. Now, the more broader element of utilitarianism. Now, I'm an economist. I use a lot of utilitarian arguments. What works, what's more efficient, blah, blah, blah. But philosophically, the utilitarian perspective, as you're presenting it, not all versions of utilitarianism per se have to be the way you were making that argument to ask the question. That form of argument assumes that we're just a collective mass. And we've produced in a pot that we've all put in, and now we're just ladling out shares to determine the maximum happiness. We're not a tribe or a collective, and it's not a common pot. Each person has made his own contribution as recognized by the income he has earned and the wealth he may have accumulated in satisfying others' wants in the production processes of the society. It is not arbitrary. It is not capricious. It is a reflection of other people's judgment as to his contribution to making products that they desire as his own means of earning the income to buy what others desire, what others are producing. Now, that does not mean that while it may not be scientific to undertake a public policy on that basis, we make those judgments all the time as individuals. You know, mother is deciding whether Johnny or Bob, her two sons, which one has been a better boy and therefore gets the extra scoop of ice cream, okay? People make those judgments, but they're subjective. Now, one form of that subjective estimate, which apropos to the earlier question that the gentleman was asking about the welfare state, is that there's nothing wrong with people being benevolent and making their own judgments and seeing others who they care about or may have fallen upon hard times or misfortunes, and charitably assisting them. And I think people do, and I personally think that it is a good thing to do just as a human being, but it is scientific illusion and ethical capriciousness to say that the state should do these things. Got time for one more, or?
I think we've got two people on microphones. So
Okay.
can we ask quick questions?
Historically, communist-leaning states have attempted to restrict free internet access or censor
Wait, a little slower. I'm not quite catching what you're saying. One more time.
Am I too close to the mic? Historically, communist-leading states have attempted to restrict free internet access or politically incorrect concepts.
Right.
Can you speak briefly on how internet proliferation, and particularly cheap mobile computing, are a catalyst of capitalism and thus upward class mobility?
Yes. If you didn't know the question, what's the effect of high tech with mobile phones and the internet and everything in breaking down the attempt traditionally of dictatorships and totalitarian societies like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, in which they tried to have a pervasive thought police, censorship of any outside news or information, filtered news and information as to what they want the people to hear. That occurs in China. You know, I've been in China a few times. I'm sitting in my hotel room. I was there giving some lectures at a university. You know, you tweak, if you're a professor, you're there tweaking your lectures, you want to check something. I go on, I click, I push Google, the screen goes dark. I mean, yes, they do those things. But what I find is that as much as governments try to continue to fill the cracks of these ways of people communicating, modern technology is enabling many people either to stay ahead or easily leapfrog over what government tries to restrain. You may have gotten the impression from my comments today that I'm a little critical of socialism. Go figure. Anyway, now I recently had an article translated into Chinese in which I in fact was criticizing some aspects of Marxist system. Well, Marxism is still the official ideology of the People's Republic of China and its communist government. So this obviously gets through these cracks in the system for people in China to read a subversive article like mine. And I consider this all to the good. This has liberated us. We should remember that all of these devices of sharing information has been liberating from the time of the invention of Gutenberg's Bible, movable type. That was revolutionary. Then the telegraph was revolutionary, right? Then the telephone was revolutionary. Then radio and television were revolutionary. And now these internet and smartphone methods are revolutionary. And they're products of capitalism, produced for profit-making purposes, but they free men and give us far greater opportunities to evade the attempts of governments to manipulate what we see, hear, and think. Okay, well, one more. Okay, yes.
This question isn't so much about socialism as capitalism, and forgive me if it's a little too specific. In an ideal free market capitalist system with minimalist government, how do you reconcile the need to counter the tendency of individual actors to establish monopolies or other anti-competitive measures, such as antitrust laws, for example, with that ideal? Or do you see a third option, some way to counter those tendencies without government interference?
Okay, everyone heard the question? Okay. First of all, I think that the most important, significant, and detrimental factor to facilitate the creation and the maintaining of monopolies, that is, a single or a cartel arrangement of a few producers with competitors hampered from entering their corner and trying to make the better and cheaper mousetrap, is the government itself. Historically, the government has, we take this for granted, right? You know how this came about? The breaking up of the AT&T monopoly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Before that, the US government gave AT&T a monopoly on telephone service. You only could buy their phone, and it sat on the desk and it had a cord, and you could only get away from it as long as the cord would go. And was there innovation? For decades, the rotary dial. By golly, we at AT&T, with our monopoly, we're innovative. The button. Oh, wow. Instead of dialing, I now push a button. I guess the market has gone about as far as it can go. But AT&T was broken up. And they let to use a Maoist phrase, let 1,000 telecommunication flowers bloom. And this is made possible by ending those government monopolies. The same thing with airline regulation. That was broken up, and there was a proliferation of more airlines. And not always, airline tickets don't always seem cheap when you buy one, but compared to the prices 50 years ago, they're unbelievably cheap in comparison. The market itself has its own correctives against these things. And that is, as long as both domestic and international trade is open, it is very difficult to sustain a privileged position in the market. The market itself will undermine this. There's many instances in which records, businessmen have gone to jail for violating, the antitrust laws, colluding. Some of the most famous cases, if you actually read the testimony, shows that there was a great electrical conspiracy, GE and Westinghouse and a few of these others back in the 1960s, and they were taken to court. But when you read the evidence, what happened? Yeah, we're going to get together and we're going to agree who gets this bid and that bid on a contract. But then they'd all start cheating on each other within one bidding round, and then they'd complain from the record, because the FBI was listening with the wiretap. You promised that you'd offer a high bid, so I'd get it this time. Yeah, but the CEO said I needed to get that contract. So they were always constantly cheating on each other. The other thing that you find is that, again, if you go look through the history of the emergence of the antitrust laws and the first regulatory commission, such as the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1877, which regulated railroads, it was the railroads who wanted the government regulation. That shows up in the congressional testimony, too, leading up to the Interstate Commerce Commission Act. Why was it? The railroad companies were going, oh, there's too much competition, our profit margins are too low, this is unfair cutthroat competition. We want government regulation to give us fair profit margins and to rationalize the market, because competition was at work. So I don't really worry much about that as long as domestic markets and international markets are free and open. At the end of the day, the market itself is its own correcting mechanism, and the government hand that is supposedly correcting the abuses often is the facilitator of the worst aspects of it.
On behalf of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to this event, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Dr. Ebeling.
Thank you.